Hello, and welcome back to our review of the Cold War crises, which helped to characterize what was going on in Europe, but also in the rest of the world as the Cold War develops in the 1950s and 1960s. Last time we looked at the Berlin crisis that led to the creation of the Berlin Wall. Today we're going to be focused on an event that became really a turning point in the Cold War in many respects because it was the most serious crisis of the Cold War period. And that, of course, is the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. So our focus really shifts away from Europe, even though one of the major players here, the Soviet Union, will be obviously a part of the European framework that we've been reviewing. But the location will be much different, and that is off the coast of the United States lies Cuba, and it was this issue of what was to be the fate of Cuba that brought these two major powers into near, almost to the point of conflict. Now, there were a number of Cold War issues that started to arise in addition to the territorial ones that we saw earlier, or some of the political disturbances in the East Central Europe and other cultural features of the Cold War that we've already sketched out for ourselves. But there have been developments since then that we need to kind of take into account before we turn to an account of the Cuban Missile Crisis itself, and that is that since the late 1950s, the United States and the Soviet Union have been engaged in yet another type of competition, so another dimension of the Cold War, really, and that was what we refer to as the space race. In October of 1957, much to the surprise of the West, the Soviet Union was able to launch the first man-made satellite into space, which they referred to as Sputnik. And this was something that was a major milestone in the development of ballistic rocketry, and one that put the Soviet Unions on the map in a big way as far as their technology was concerned with respect to putting objects into space. In this case, it was an inanimate object, and one that was, but one that, as I said, was able to go into an orbit around the Earth, the first country or political system to do so. So this had a major impact on the Cold War in various ways, but above all because what it said was that the U.S. and the Soviet Union were now going to be engaged in a technological competition that would involve things like the space race, but also it reflected directly on their military capacity. In other words, the degree to which they could build rockets that would have a range much beyond their own borders. And so the space race really was kind of a foil for some of these other issues that were increasingly imposing themselves on the Cold War map of Europe and the rest of the world. So in this case, the question was, if your competitor could put up a man-made object into space, and then later would be able to put up living creatures, dogs as it turned out, and also humans, this meant that the level of sophistication was such that you had to be concerned with the ability of your potential enemy of launching ballistic missiles against you using nuclear warheads. And so this was really the message here that the United States took away from the Sputnik success, and one that put into high gear the American space program, because although there was also a sense of national pride here that was at stake, more important was the idea that they did not want to see the Soviet Union move too far ahead, if indeed they were, in this so-called space race or missile race. And so after 1957, you see again an acceleration on both sides towards greater technological developments in rocketry. By 1961, the Soviet Union is able to put up an astronaut who orbits the Earth, Yuri Gagarin. And again, this beats the United States to the punch in that respect, and causes the United States to further accelerate their efforts to get people into space and to demonstrate the rocket, the rocket science, let's say, that the United States was developing at the time. As it turned out, within a few months, we put up our first man in space, or person in space, and after that point, the United States, as I said, in the Soviet Union, would kind of trade punches, so to speak, in this regard, with the United States ultimately winning the space race with their landing on the moon. But in the meantime, as I said, the real issue here is what did this have to say, the space race, about the nuclear potential of either side or both sides? So there were, at this stage, by the late 50s, early 60s, intercontinental ballistic missiles, there were medium-range ballistic missiles, and there were also intermediate-range ballistic missiles that had been developed. And all these things were certainly a great advance over the nuclear potential of the past, which relied exclusively on airplanes or bomber planes to deliver them. The issue over Cuba resulted, or the crisis, really revolved around this whole question of to what extent Cuba could be used as a base or a launching pad for some of these missiles that could be launched into the United States. And so up to this point, it was pretty clear that the United States saw the Western Hemisphere, particularly the Caribbean and Latin America, as a province that the United States looked over, and so therefore, from the Monroe Doctrine on, would not find any foreign intervention acceptable on any terms. But something happened in the late 50s which seemed to turn things in a different direction as far as the United States was concerned, and that was a revolution that led to the rise of a socialist or pro-communist regime under Fidel Castro. And by 1960-61, it was apparent that Castro was moving closer to the Soviet Union in terms of his allegiances, and was in that sense defiant to the United States and its unspoken assumption of predominance in this part of the world. So all this were part of the factors that were in play during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The lead up to the crisis itself, however, also needs to be emphasized, and that is that in 1961, in the spring, the United States backs a coup attempt, failed invasion of the so-called Bay of Pigs, which was meant to launch an invasion that would allow for Cubans who were opposed to the Castro regime to overthrow his government, newly established since 1959, and make it possible for a new pro-American type government to emerge. This was a disaster, however, and one that made it clear that the Castro government was not going to be easily dealt with, certainly not through these kind of violent or aggressive measures. There were further efforts on the part of the United States government to try to undermine Castro's rule, and if possible, even to eliminate Castro himself. So there was kind of almost a frantic effort on the part of the United States to make sure that Cuba did not become part of the communist orbit that seemed to be developing in different parts of the world, not just in Europe, but also perhaps in Latin America. And Cuba would be the starting point for that as far as the U.S. foreign policy was concerned. So in that same period, we saw that Kennedy and Khrushchev meet in Vienna, but their focus there seemed to be more on Berlin, remember, and not so much on what was going on in Cuba. So what was happening in Cuba was really a different sort of thing, and one that, as I said, was part of a kind of a hidden agenda that Khrushchev was pursuing. His feeling was that the United States was applying pressure to the Soviet Union and its communist allies in East Central Europe by maintaining its very strong presence in NATO, and using NATO and NATO countries, including that of Turkey, as kind of a wider perimeter which could be used to base their missiles against their enemies in the Soviet Union and elsewhere. So, and in fact, in Turkey, you see some of these missiles being based there, right on the border of the Soviet Union with Turkey. And Khrushchev was angry and upset about that and thought it was unfair. And believed that it was necessary to show the United States what it felt like to have missiles on your border regions, but also ones that threatened you on a daily basis. And so this helped to inform his decision, a very controversial one as it turned out, to use Cuba as a point of establishing missile launching facilities inside of Cuba itself. And so as Cuba and the Soviet Union moved closer into a relationship, the Russians took this as an opening for them to pursue this policy that Khrushchev wanted to implement as soon as he could. So this was called Operation Anadyr. As I said, it was kept under wraps as much as possible because clearly the Soviet Union did not want to advertise the fact that they were going to base missiles in Cuba. But that's exactly what they were doing. The problem was that it was very difficult to conceal those sorts of activities. And so what happens early on, after these missile facilities are being constructed, is that U-2 spy planes, remember they were part of that episode that happened in 1960. They're flying over Cuba very regularly, monitoring what's going on in the pro-communist regime of Fidel Castro. And in the process of doing that, they're able to come away with plenty of photographic evidence that these sorts of missile launch stations are being constructed in remote parts of Cuba, and they could only be used for aggressive purposes towards, in other words, launching an attack against the United States. So the United States now getting wind of the fact that there's a possibility that on their very border, some 90 miles off the coast of Florida, there could be a nuclear threat, was something that was unacceptable to the government of the day, and one that raised the stakes of this particular issue once it became apparent again that the Soviet Union was engaged in this sort of activity. So very rapidly, after having discovered beyond a doubt that these missile launch stations were being constructed, the United States escalates the crisis and decides to make public this information. And in October of 1962, shortly after, again, this information was fully digested, John F. Kennedy goes before the American people and on television and announces that their U.S. surveillance has determined that there were these missile bases being constructed and that the United States was going to take decisive actions to ensure that these missile bases would cease to exist. In other words, there was no sense of compromise here or trying to negotiate the future of these missile bases. As far as the U.S. government was concerned, they had to be removed, pure and simple. This sort of ultimatum then was issued by the United States in October of 1962, and one that, as I said, was a very serious one, much more than the ultimatum that Khrushchev had issued earlier in the case of West Berlin. This meant basically that the United States would take any action it felt necessary in order to achieve the goal that Kennedy announced before the public, which was to have these missile bases dismantled, but no less important was their insistence that the Soviet Union could no longer ship in war materials or materials that could be used for constructing these missile bases or any nuclear weapons. And so a blockade was erected around Cuba and would be enforced by the United States Navy, and one in which, if it was breached, would result in a conflict. And so all of a sudden, again, it looked as though rather than moving towards a diplomatic arrangement here that might resolve this issue, the United States and the Soviet Union were moving closer and closer to trading blows over what was going on inside of Cuba. Now, the Cuban government wasn't going to be have the final say here, as you can imagine, because like the Eastern European countries under communism that we've already reviewed, they more or less had to go along with the Soviet leadership, whether they liked it or not. So, irrespective of what Fidel Castro might have wanted to achieve in this period of crisis, it was the Soviet Union that was really negotiating on the side of the Soviet Union against the United States. Now, there was certainly a lot of denial on the part of the Soviet Union as to what was going on, and a reluctance to admit what was happening as far as their missile-based construction was concerned. We might pause here for a moment, as this crisis now has come to a head almost overnight, or so it seems, and one that has led both the Soviet Union and the United States to a point of potential conflict, possibly a nuclear exchange. One reason why the Soviet Union might have taken this daring move that I mentioned earlier that Khrushchev seemed to be fixated upon was that the Soviet Union itself wanted to take an advantage of the fact of a new country established by a left-wing style revolutionary and one that was pro-Soviet in many ways. So he, as a way of increasing the influence of the Soviet Union in this part of the world, and as I said, and also putting pressure on the United States to recognize that there was an unfair balance here in terms of how the United States could threaten the Soviet Union versus how the opposite might occur. So these sorts of things were all part of that thinking that was going into Khrushchev's decision here to have a showdown over Cuba. Another reason that was no doubt had a place in Khrushchev's thinking here was the fact that in the recent years, Communist China had been increasingly challenging Soviet predominance in the communist world. For the most part, China was not considered to be a major superpower, certainly, and one that didn't seem to have the same power or influence that the Soviet Union did. But the Chairman Mao, the leader of Communist China, felt like after Stalin had left the scene that the Soviet Union was losing its way in terms of being an international leader of communism, and that it was not taking a hard enough line against the capitalist opponents across the globe. And so as a way of kind of shoring up its position vis-a-vis China and any other potential rivals, Khrushchev might have felt that this was an important point that could be made to underscore how decisive and firm the Soviet Union was when it came to these international affairs. Another important factor here that we need to consider is the fact that the Soviet Union itself, despite its successes in the space race, felt that it was increasingly falling behind the United States in terms of its missile production. So that was something that you don't want to reveal to the public, obviously, but it was clear that the Soviet Union wanted to make sure that their deficit in this area was not exposed. And so one way of concealing it would be to take a firm line or maintain a strong position, even if you're in a weaker position in real terms as far as your military capacity was concerned. So these were very important factors, and as I said, not all of them certainly were obvious at the time. In retrospect, we've been able to assess this, but then we need to keep that in mind as we see, or try to explain why it was that these two countries, as I said, which up to now had followed rules that led away from or averted the possibility of direct war, might have lost that thread at this point. So again, let's return to that timeline in October, which seemed to be, creating anxiety across the United States and certainly across the world. And Europe especially was looking on, hoping that this crisis would not end up in the worst of possible places. So the tensions, as I said, continue to rise all the way up until the last week of October. So at the beginning of October, you see the announcement on that Kennedy makes to the U.S. public, and then behind the scenes activities between the Soviets and the United States trying to figure out who's at fault here and what's going to happen. And then on October 25th, another U-2 spy plane goes over Cuba to see to what extent the Soviets are either stepping up their process of building these bases or dismantling them, is shot down over Cuba. And this then raises the temperature even higher than it was before. The next day, an even more serious incident takes place when the United States blocks Soviet ships or intercepts them from going through the blockade that had been established by the U.S. Navy. So they turn them back and say, look, you cannot go through this blockade because we've erected it. And of course that would be a cause for a conflict if the Soviets had decided to breach this blockade, which they didn't. But this had raised, as I said, the stakes so high at this point that Khrushchev decided that, that it was not necessary or even desirable to go to the next step, which is possibly trading blows with the United States, and especially if it launched a nuclear war between these two countries. And so he decides behind the scenes to work out a compromise with the Kennedy administration, which was now, as I said, taking a very firm line against what was going on inside of Cuba. And so much of these negotiations, of course, were behind closed doors, and nobody really knew what was going on except these two, the diplomats from both sides. One of the secret aspects of this negotiation had to do with those Jupiter missiles that were based in Turkey in a raid against the Soviet Union along its border. And so Kennedy administration, also seeking a way out of this showdown stance that they had assumed, decided that they would remove those Jupiter missiles as a way of appeasing Khrushchev's demand. In response, or in return, the Soviet Union would then agree to dismantle those missile bases that they had begun constructing and ship them back to the Soviet Union, thereby backing down from this brink of war that seemed like they were both heading towards. So, in effect, the Cuban Missile Crisis, as I said, was being resolved kind of in secret outside the public sphere. But in the meanwhile, everybody was basically holding their breath, hoping that it could be sorted out without resorting to a major war. Inside the United States, for example, the fear that a nuclear holocaust would ensue in the next few days or weeks was certainly paramount in the minds of most people. because no one was quite sure how this the crisis could end. But as it turned out, when the two major superpowers had a stare down, Khrushchev blinked first, but then later Kennedy also blinked, and this meant that both sides were ready to diffuse the whole situation, leading to a compromise. And so secretly, again, this decision to dismantle or to take out these Jupiter missiles in Turkey would ensue in the next few months, relieving the United States of those obligations, but also satisfying the demands that Khrushchev had put on the table, which was a necessary condition for him to back down as far as Cuba, the Cuban missiles were concerned. So on the face of it, it looked, at least in the public press, as though the Soviets had certainly had been forced into retreat. And in some respects, that's true. That was a correct observation. But in reality, as I said, there was a much more complicated picture than that, and one that, as I said, that basically helped to resolve a situation that could have led to a nuclear conflict and thereby ending the Cold War in one fell swoop. So what can we make of the Cuban Missile Crisis then in retrospect? In the immediate aftermath, it was apparent that both sides had come so close to open warfare that they were both kind of, cascaded or chastised by this experience. And so they realized that the Cold War could, over factors beyond their control, could escalate very quickly and lead to a complicated situation that might result in this kind of nuclear contest being launched. And so they decided that the best thing for them to do is to try to work harder to avoid that sort of cataclysmic occurrence as much as possible. And so both sides now paused and tried to look for ways of bringing about greater agreement and negotiation over how they should handle these sorts of issues. So not surprisingly, in the next year or two, both the United States and the Soviet Union sought ways of kind of limiting their testing of nuclear weapons, and perhaps also looking at ways of limiting the spread of the nuclear card or capabilities. So what they wanted to do is to make sure that those who possessed the nuclear warhead capabilities was a very small or limited club, and that they themselves would be in charge or oversee the development of affairs relating to nuclear weapons. And in subsequent years, you'll see that greater movement towards trying to, if not completely eliminate nuclear weapons, certainly to limit their growth and to rein in on this missile race, which, as I said, had already begun earlier. Another immediate impact of the Cuban Missile Crisis in Europe, our main area of concern, was that many people certainly expressed a sigh of relief once the crisis died down, but were convinced now that the threat of nuclear war was overhanging their heads, and that this certainly underscored that. And so for the most part, Europeans felt like they needed to do all they could through popular pressure to try to show their displeasure over this idea of using the nuclear option if there was a disagreement between the two superpowers or other forces in this Cold War arena. So basically, as I said, the Cuban Missile Crisis had the impact of raising the awareness of how important it was to struggle for peace rather than looking for ways of contesting one another in this international arena.